Right now, as you watch this video, one of the most important shipping lanes on Earth is effectively shut down, not because of a hurricane, not because of an earthquake, not because some navigation authority declared it off its limits for maintenance. It is shut down because Iran, a country under international sanctions for decades, a country that just lost its supreme leader and much of its military leadership to American and Israeli airstrikes, is still somehow holding the global economy hostage, and the choke point it is using as the weapon. A strip of water roughly 20 miles wide at its narrowest point, a place most people couldn't find on a map, a place called the Strait of Hormuz. By the time this crisis is over, it will have reshaped global energy markets, tested the limits of American military power, and proven once again a simple, uncomfortable truth. In the modern world, he who controls the Strait of Hormuz has a grip on the throat of civilization. Today, we're going to explain why that is and what it means for you, even if you've never owned a barrel of oil or cared about Middle Eastern geopolitics in your life. The story begins with a failed negotiation. On February 26, 2026, the US and Iran held their third round of indirect talks in Geneva, Switzerland, and walked away with massive disagreements on the core issues. The day after, Trump told reporters he was unsatisfied with progress. Then came words that sent a chill through the diplomatic world. It would be better not to use force, but sometimes you have to. Nobody took that as small talk. 48 hours later, Tehran's skies lit up. President Trump announced that the United States and Israel had launched a joint military strike against Iran, declaring the goal was to destroy Iran's missile capabilities and prevent it from acquiring nuclear weapons. Wikipedia, the Israeli Air Force, claimed nearly 50 fighter jets had completely destroyed the underground bunker of Supreme Leader Khamenei in Tehran, dropping roughly 100 bombs on the facility. Wikipedia, and then came the bombshell that shocked the world. Iran's Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, along with several senior military commanders, was killed in the strikes. In one night, the entire chessboard of the Middle East had been flipped. Iran did not stay silent. Using missiles, drones, and aerial strikes, Iran launched its counteroffensive and imposed a blockade on the Strait of Hormuz, targeting tankers linked to the United States, Israel, and even some European nations. Consider the stakes. Roughly 1/5 of the world's entire seaborne oil trade passes through the Strait of Hormuz. With the blockade in place, global energy markets went into panic. Analysts warned that Brent crude could potentially breach $150 per barrel, representing the most severe supply disruption since the 1970s oil crisis. This was Iran's ace card. We can't match your aircraft carriers, but we can choke the world's oil pipeline. War is never just about great powers. On March 11, 2026, a Thai cargo vessel was struck and set ablaze in the waters of the Strait of Hormuz. The image, released by the Thai Navy, showed the ship engulfed in flames, sailors jumping into the sea to survive. This was not a simulation. The world was literally on fire. While the strait burned, something unexpected happened in Tehran streets. On March 9, 2026, crowds gathered at Tehran's Revolution Square to pledge loyalty to Iran's new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, the son of the fallen leader. He wasted no time. In his first public statement after taking office, the new supreme leader declared that Iran would continue to use the blockade of the Strait of Hormuz as a weapon. The leadership changed. The defiance did not. The blockade forced Persian Gulf oil producers to dust off contingency plans that had sat untouched for decades. Saudi Arabia's east-west pipeline became the only viable alternative export route, a 1,200-kilometer artery stretching from the Gulf Coast east across the Arabian Peninsula to the Red Sea port of Yanbu, according to Bloomberg. The pipeline was running at its maximum capacity of 7 million barrels per day. But there is a brutal catch. These overland pipelines fall within missile and drone range of the warring nations, making them just as vulnerable as ships attempting to pass through the strait, out of the tiger's jaws, straight into the wolf's den. What about the U.S. Navy? Why not just escort the tankers through? The answer is more uncomfortable than most expected. Democratic Senator Chris Murphy, speaking after a closed-door congressional briefing, stated that the Trump administration had no plan for what to do if the strait closed, and no idea how to reopen it. MIT international security scholar Caitlin Talmadge put it bluntly, in the Strait of Hormuz, Iran has the upper hand, and the U.S. has no good options. The strait is shallow waters, narrow lanes, and Iran's arsenal of mines, fast attack boats, drones, and shore-based missiles all neutralize America's technological edge. As the war dragged on, Trump's patience ran dry. Trump posted that Iran had 48 hours to reach a deal or open the Strait of Hormuz, threatening that if the deadline was missed, every disaster would fall upon Iran. And then came the statement that turned heads worldwide at a White House press conference. Trump declared that reopening the strait was the top priority, and that transit fees for ships passing through should be collected by the United States, not Iran. Read that again. The United States, not Iran. This wasn't just about winning a war. This was about taking control of the world's most critical shipping lane. On April 7th, the US and Iran announced a temporary ceasefire. Markets sighed with relief. That relief lasted less than 24 hours. On the very first day of the ceasefire, Israeli forces launched their largest airstrike yet against Hezbollah in Lebanon, and Iran declared the ceasefire violated, closing the Strait of Hormuz once again, according to Saudi Global Market Intelligence. Only 4 ships were permitted to pass through the strait on April 8th, compared to over 100 ships per day before the conflict began. 4 ships. Down from over 100, that number represents a global supply chain slowly suffocating in real time. Yet in the middle of the chaos, something strange and new was quietly forming. British maritime analytics firm Windward reported that the Strait of Hormuz had evolved into a dual-corridor system, a northern channel controlled by Iran's Revolutionary Guards near Larak Island, and a new southern corridor hugging the Omani coastline. Sina Finance, Iran's foreign ministry spokesman, confirmed that in recent days some vessels had been permitted to pass through the strait after coordinating with Iranian authorities. Translation: comply with Iran's rules. And you get through, cross Iran, and you wait or burn. The Strait of Hormuz is becoming Iran's toll booth. So here is what we've witnessed in 2026. Let's step away from geopolitics for a moment. Let's talk about you. When you woke up this morning, you probably didn't think about the Strait of Hormuz, but oil was there. It is woven into the fabric of modern life in ways most people never see. About 75% of all the oil the world consumes is burned as fuel. When oil prices spike by 30 to 50%, shipping goods costs more. Trucking companies add fuel surcharges. Farmers pay more to run tractors. The price of almost everything goes up, but it goes beyond fuel. Look at the tag on your shirt. If it says polyester, nylon, spandex, or acrylic, you are wearing oil. Our entire fast-gen fashion industry is built on petroleum-derived synthetic fibers. Polyester alone is estimated to be present in roughly 60% of clothing worldwide. Oil is also deeply embedded in the food system. Nitrogen fertilizers, which feed roughly half the world's population, are produced using energy-intensive fossil fuel processes. Pesticides are synthesized from petrochemicals. Food packaging is almost entirely petroleum-derived plastic. Walk through any modern home. The asphalt on the road, the plastic pipes in your walls, the paint, the synthetic rubber, your smartphone casing, your toothpaste, cosmetics, medical devices, aspirin capsules, all rely on petrochemicals. This is what the IEA means when it says petrochemicals are becoming the largest driver of global oil demand ahead of cars and aviation. Even as we transition to renewable energy, the world's demand for oil-derived materials keeps growing. When oil reaches $120 a barrel, gas prices at the pump approach $5 a gallon in the US. In developing nations like Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh, it means genuine economic crisis, currency devaluations, blackouts, food price inflation, and political instability. For these economies, an extended Hormuz closure is genuinely catastrophic. Can we ever break free from this dependence? The honest answer is yes, but not soon, not easily, and not completely. The electrification of transportation is a massive structural shift. Wind and solar costs have plummeted, making renewable energy the cheapest new source of electricity. But even if global oil demand peaks around 2030 under current stated policies, the decline will be gradual. A genuine escape requires mass electrification, green hydrogen for heavy industry, and a shift away from petroleum-based plastics. Energy self-sufficiency, powered by renewables, is the most effective long-term antidote to choke point vulnerability. But none of this happens in a few years. The world in 2026 remains overwhelmingly dependent on oil. Every time Iran threatens the strait, the natural response is, can't the world just go around it? Not really. Not at the scale that matters. Saudi Arabia built the East-West crude oil pipeline, the Petroline, specifically to bypass the strait, running 1,200 kilometers from Al-Quaiq across the Arabian Peninsula to the Red Sea port of Yanbu. It was originally built during the Iran's and Iraq War with that exact contingency in mind. Its design capacity after expansion reaches 7 million barrels per day on paper, a figure that was put to the test for the first time ever when it was converted to full capacity on March 11, 2026. But while the pipeline can move 7 million barrels per day, the Yanbu terminals have a combined nominal loading capacity of around 4.5 million barrels per day, according to Argus Media, with energy consultancy Vortexa estimating the operational throughput closer to 3 million barrels per day under current wartime conditions. That is a remarkable achievement, but it covers only a fraction of the roughly 20 million barrels per day that normally transit the strait. The UAE operates a 400-kilometer pipeline from Abu Dhabi to the Gulf of Oman port of Fujairah, with a capacity of around 1.5 million barrels per day. During the 2026 crisis, it was running at approximately 71% utilization, leaving some spare capacity, but its total contribution remains small relative to the overall shortfall. If you add up all pipeline alternatives running at their maximum Saudi Petroline, the UAE's Adkop, Iran's small Gorhades and Jask line, and Iraq's Kirkuk and Ceyhan pipeline, you get according to IEA estimates. Roughly 3.5 to 5.5 million barrels per day of bypass capacity, as Engineering News records summarized. There currently exist 2 overland pipelines that can at best move 4 to 5 million barrels per day to export terminals. Against 20 million barrels per day, that leaves a gap of more than 13 million barrels per day with nowhere to go. And for liquefied natural gas from Qatar and the UAE, there are 0 pipeline alternatives to global markets. Every molecule must pass through the strait. If pipelines fail, ships could theoretically sail south around the Cape of Good Hope. But this adds roughly 20 to 25 days of sailing time for journeys to Europe, requiring approximately 50% more ships to maintain the same delivery volume. It is a temporary, extremely expensive patch, not a solution. So, Iran's capacity to disrupt the strait gives it extraordinary leverage. But can Iran simply close it indefinitely? No. Leverage has limits. First, Iran's own oil exports depend on the strait. Charging a $2 million toll is a fragile business model. Second, Iran's economy is severely strained. Striking Iran's power plants would devastate hospitals and water facilities inside Iran itself. Third, the international community has a deep common interest in keeping the strait open. Even China, Iran's biggest economic backer, receives a large share of the oil and LNG that passes through the strait and cannot tolerate a permanent closure. Fourth, Iran's military is being degraded daily by U.S. strikes. And finally, the Iranian people are suffering enormously, facing limits to their patience as economic conditions deteriorate. So how does this resolve? The U.S. has several risky options. Naval escorts, which are vulnerable to mines, a weakness the U.S. Navy has struggled with since the very first day of Operation Earnest Will in 1987, and which military analysts say has still not been adequately addressed. Blockading Iranian oil exports, which could draw China into the conflict. Ground operations on Karg Island, which would require a massive military commitment, or a negotiated settlement, which remains the most likely path despite incompatible political demands. History tells us the Strait of Hormuz is a constantly shifting arena of power, leverage, fear, and calculation. Every actor is simultaneously trying to protect its interests and avoid a catastrophic miscalculation. We started this video with a simple image, a narrow strip of water holding the global economy hostage. We've seen how decades of geopolitics and oil discovery made this choke point so vital. We've seen how Iran, despite absorbing massive military strikes, has used its geography to hold the global economy in suspended animation. We've seen how oil touches every aspect of our lives, and how our dependence on it is diminishing too slowly to save us from this crisis. We've seen that the alternatives to the strait are radically insufficient, confirmed by the IEA, the EIA, and the engineers who built the bypass infrastructure themselves. The Strait of Hormuz is about the nature of power in the 21st century. It is about the gap between military strength and economic leverage. It is about the uncomfortable fact that the world's most advanced societies can be brought to the edge of recession by a country laying sea mines in a channel that hasn't changed in 10,000 years. This crisis will resolve. Every Hormuz crisis in history has resolved. The world has a compelling collective interest in keeping oil flowing, but it will resolve on terms that leave the underlying tensions intact. The geography of the Persian Gulf will not change. The Strait of Hormuz will be threatened again. As long as roughly 1/5 of the world's oil consumption flows through 20 miles of contested water, the question is not whether this happens again. The question is whether, by the time it does, we will have done enough to ensure that the answer is not the same. If you like this video, please subscribe to the channel. Your support is our greatest motivation, and let me know your thoughts in the comments below.